A Navy SEAL squad vanishes off Yemen. Radio contact cuts out at dawn. 22 years later, their rigid hull inflatable is discovered wedged in a sea cave, sealed tight from the inside. They left like any other night, laughing, checking rifles, a commander tucking a laminated photo of twin babies over his heart. When divers force the hatch, 7 men are found in full kit, still at their posts, and a frantic message scrawled in dried blood makes the scene feel flagrantly wrong. Then, an 8th man walks into an embassy years later with a story that doesn't line up, dragging impossible timelines and quiet, deliberate lies. Who would betray his brothers? And what truth was worth leaving them to suffocate in the dark? The deck of the USS Constellation breathed with the ocean at 230 hours, her vast superstructure blocking out half the stars. The Gulf of Aden stretched dark and flat in every direction, the kind of calm that made young sailors nervous and veterans watchful. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Halloway stood at the rail in his tactical gear, one hand resting on the cold metal, the other turning over a photograph protected by laminated plastic. Twin girls, 4 months old. They'd learned to smile the week before he deployed. "They got your eyes, Skipper." Chief Petty Officer David Reeves materialized beside him, his own gear already cinched tight, explosives kit secured across his chest. He spoke quietly, the way men do when night and operational security demand it. Halloway slipped the photo into the waterproof pocket over his heart. "Anya says they got my stubborn. Won't sleep unless they're both in the same crib. Smart kids. Safety in numbers." Reeves scanned the deck where the rest of Detachment Bravo was conducting final equipment checks on the rigid hull inflatable boat suspended from the davits. "You good for this one?" It was the question Reeves always asked before they went over the side. Never doubting Halloway's competence, just confirming his head was clear. 3 deployments together had taught them the language of small gestures. "I'm good." Halloway turned from the rail. "Let's get the boys ready." The Arhib hung 30 feet above the black water, a 26-foot Zodiac equipped with twin outboards and enough fuel for 12 hours at patrol speed. She carried the designation 37 Echo stenciled on her hull, though tonight she wore nothing that would identify her as American except the men who crewed her. Petty Officer First Class Jerome Patterson, Rome to everyone who mattered, knelt beside the communications array, his fingers dancing over connections with the practiced efficiency of a man raised to respect machinery and higher callings. His father preached in Detroit that God moved through preparation and attention to detail. Rome applied that gospel to radio frequencies and encrypted channels. "Comms, hot and clean, Commander." Rome's voice carried the trace of his father's pulpit rhythm. "We'll have satellite uplink until we close to 2 clicks from shore, then it's line of sight only." "Copy that." Halloway moved around the boat, checking each of his 7 men with the quiet intensity that had earned their trust in Kandahar and kept them alive in worse places than this. Travis McNeil sat on the gunwale, checking his rifle's action for the 3rd time. At 26, he was the 2nd youngest on the team, quick with a joke and quicker with a weapon. He caught Halloway's eye and grinned. "Just making sure she's ready, sir. You know me." "I do." Halloway clasped his shoulder briefly. "That's why you're here." The mission brief had been straightforward enough to make them all uneasy. Intel suggested an Al-Qaeda safe house operating from a fishing village 40 kilometers up the coast, one of dozens being monitored in the 2 years since the USS Cole bombing had killed 17 sailors just 300 miles from where they now floated. Date Bravo would insert by sea, establish an observation post on the ridgeline above the village, photograph anyone coming or going, and extract at first light. Routine work, the kind that got people killed when they stopped respecting it. "Gentlemen." Halloway gathered them with a gesture, 8 men forming a tight circle on the deck. Above them, a waxing moon hid behind thin clouds. "You know the drill. We're ghosts tonight. Eyes only. If they make us, we disengage and extract. Nobody plays hero. Nobody makes contact unless we have no choice. Rome, you keep that satellite window open as long as you can." Reeves, you've got demo prepped if we need to cover our exit. McNeil, you and I are on point when we go ashore." He looked at each face in turn. Young men, hard men, all of them volunteers who'd survived training that broke stronger candidates. His responsibility. His brothers. "Questions?" Silence answered him. "Good, let's—" "Commander." Rome held up a hand, one finger pressed to his headset. His face shifted from concentration to concern. "We've got a civilian vessel on radar, 15 clicks northeast, heading this way. Fishing trawler by the signature." The deck officer, a Lieutenant Holloway didn't know well, consulted with his watch team. "They're outside our security perimeter. Not responding to radio hails, but that's normal for local traffic. They don't want to explain why they're fishing at night." Holloway exchanged a glance with Reeves. Yemen's coastline crawled with smugglers, gunrunners, and worse. That's why Date Bravo was here. But operational security meant the Constellation couldn't exactly announce her presence or warn off curious boats. "How long until we clear their path?" Holloway asked. 40 minutes at their current speed," the deck officer said. "You'll be in the water and gone before they're close enough to see anything." "Then we go now." Holloway turned to his team. "Mount up." They moved with the choreographed efficiency of men who'd practiced this under 100 tiartanitat. Times, swinging into the Arhib and securing gear with practiced speed. Holloway settled into the coxswain position, hands on the controls, feeling the boat rock gently in her davits. Reeves took the bow position, McNeil and Rome amidships with the comm equipment, the other four positioned to provide covering fire in any direction. The deck officer gave the signal. Machinery hummed, and 3-7 Echo began her descent toward the dark water. The ocean accepted them with barely a splash. Reeves released the davit hooks, and Holloway fired the engines. They caught immediately, a low, reliable growl that vibrated through the hull. He eased them away from the Constellation's massive shadow, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders. 3-7 Echo, this is Constellation Actual, the radio crackled. You are clear to proceed. Next scheduled contact at 0347 hours. Copy, Constellation. 3-7 Echo proceeding to station. Holloway's voice was calm, professional. The voice of a man who'd done this before and would do it again. We'll see you at sunrise. He advanced the throttles, and the Arhib's bow lifted as she found her plane. Behind them, the Constellation was already fading into darkness, her lights dimmed for operational security. Ahead, the Yemeni coastline was a darker line against a dark sky, invisible except to men with night vision and precise coordinates. Rome hummed something under his breath. Holloway recognized it after a moment. Amazing Grace. The kid hummed it before every operation, a prayer without words that had seen them through worse than this. The Arhib sliced through calm water at 28 knots, her engines steady, her crew silent except for the occasional murmured check-in. Holloway scanned the horizon through his night vision monocular, marking the fishing boat's lights far to the northeast. No threat to their approach. At 0347 hours, Rome's voice broke the silence. Constellation, 3-7 Echo. We have eyes on target, all clear, proceeding as planned. Roger, 3-7 Echo, safe hunting. Constellation out. They continued up the coast, paralleling the shore at 3 kilometers out. The village that was their objective glowed faintly in the distance, a handful of lights that marked human habitation in a landscape of stone and sand. Holloway studied it through the monocular, comparing what he saw to the satellite imagery burned into his memory. Looking good, he murmured. We'll insert at the secondary point, 2 clicks south. Reeves, you see anything that worries you? The chief scanned the coastline with his own optics. Negative, sir. Beach looks clear, no lights moving inland. If they've got security, they're not advertising it. Holloway nodded and adjusted their course slightly, aiming for the designated insertion point. The Arhib responded smoothly, her engines purring, her hull cutting through water that seemed more like oil than liquid, in the starlight. McNeil shifted position, his rifle held casually across his chest. Easy night, he said. Almost too easy. There's no such thing, Reeves replied, but his tone was light. That's just called good planning." They shared a quiet laugh, the kind that came from men comfortable with each other and their work. Holloway felt it too, that sense of a mission unfolding exactly as briefed. No surprises, no complications. The kind of operation they'd run a dozen times before. The coastline grew closer. Holloway began to throttle back, preparing for the careful approach that would bring them within meters of the beach without grounding on rocks or coral. Rome kept his attention on the communications gear, ready to relay any change in orders. The other four scanned their sectors with unwavering discipline. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything was perfect. And in the Combat Information Center aboard the USS Constellation, a junior watch officer noted the time in his log, 0447 hours. He marked it carefully, the way the Navy trained its people to mark everything, every moment and position documented for the historical record. He didn't know it yet, but that notation would be examined by investigators, intelligence analysts, and heartbroken families for the next 22 years. Because at 0900 hours, when 37 Echo's scheduled extraction window opened, that junior officer would note a different entry. A concerning one. And then, 90 minutes later, with the sun climbing over a calm sea and the radio returning only silence, he would knock on the captain's cabin door with the news no commanding officer ever wants to hear. For now, though, there was only the peaceful notation of time and position. A boat and 8 men proceeding as planned. An ordinary night in an extraordinary war. The watch officer returned to his station, unaware that he'd just recorded the last confirmed moment anyone would see Detachment Bravo alive. The helicopter noise died 13 days ago. Now the Gulf of Aden carried only the slap of waves against hulls and the steady drone of patrol boats running grid patterns that had long since stopped making sense. Anya Holloway stood at her kitchen window in base housing, staring at the San Diego morning fog without seeing it. Her hands moved automatically, bottle, formula, shake, while her mind ran the same calculations it had been running since the knock on the door 3 days earlier. 6-hour mission, 12-hour window accounting for delays, 24 hours before real worry sets in. They were at 72 hours now. Behind her, one of the twins started to fuss. She couldn't remember which one she'd just fed. The days had become a blur of Navy liaisons with practiced sympathy, phone calls that said nothing new, and the terrible mathematics of hope. How many more hours before missing became something worse? The doorbell rang. Another officer with another update that wouldn't tell her anything. She opened the door to Commander Walsh, the family liaison, holding a tablet and wearing the expression she'd already learned to dread. Not grief yet, but its shadow. "Mrs. Holloway, may I come in?" Anya stepped aside. Through the open door she could see 2 more Navy sedans parked along the street. Other wives were getting visits this morning. The realization made her legs weak. "They're expanding the search," Walsh said, and Anya heard what he wasn't saying, because the first one failed. "How much bigger?" 1,200 square miles. We're bringing in additional air assets from Bahrain, coordinating with Allied vessels in the area, and the SEALs are deploying their own recovery teams. He set the tablet on her coffee table, pulling up a map covered in overlapping search grids. "This is the largest operation of its kind we've conducted in this region." "That's not an answer. That's you telling me you still don't know where he is." Walsh's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I'm telling you we're using every resource." "Did they crash? Did something hit them?" Her voice climbed despite her efforts to control it. One of the twins was crying now, a thin wail from the nursery. "There has to be something. Wreckage, oil, anything." "Not yet." "What does that mean, not yet? It's been 3 days in calm seas with perfect visibility. You've had helicopters, satellites." She stopped, reading his face. "You don't think you're going to find anything, do you?" Walsh set down the tablet. "Mrs. Holloway, I've been doing this job for 11 years. I've seen equipment failures, navigation errors, weather events that came out of nowhere. I've never seen a case where we found absolutely nothing this far into a search." He paused. "But that doesn't mean we're stopping." Then what does it mean? He looked at her directly, and she saw it then, the thing he'd been trying not to show. Not just professional concern, but genuine confusion. Fear, even. It means we don't understand what happened out there. The search command center aboard the USS Constellation ran on coffee and controlled desperation. Banks of monitors showed real-time feeds from 4 helicopters, 3 patrol boats, and a P-3 Orion maritime surveillance aircraft running systematic sweeps at 1,500 feet. Lieutenant Commander Bradford Keene, heading the operation, stood at the center of it all, watching the screens update with another hour of nothing. Southern Grid, Quadrant 7, complete, a watch officer reported. No contacts, no anomalies. Log it, shift to Quadrant 8. The same pattern they'd been running since dawn on day 1. The same results. Behind him, a satellite imagery specialist named Ortiz had been pulling archived feeds from the night of the disappearance, running them through enhancement protocols that squeezed detail from darkness. She'd been at it for 16 hours straight. "Commander, you should see this." Keene crossed to her station. On screen, the thermal overlay of the Yemeni coastline looked like every other segment they'd examined. Dark water, darker land, the heat signature of a fishing village reduced to orange pixels. "What am I looking at?" "Timestamp 0355, the night of." Ortiz zoomed in. "This is 37 Echo's last confirmed position, based on their SATCOM uplink. They were here, 2 kilometers offshore, running parallel to the coast. We know that already." "Right, but watch what happens at EO 447. She advanced the feed frame by frame. They should still be in the insertion phase. Speed would be low, maybe 8 knots, closing on shore, but look at the heat signature. The small bright spot that was the Arhib's engines didn't dim or slow. It moved, fast, heading not toward the coast but away from it, angling southeast at what looked like full throttle. "They're running," Keene said. "From what?" "I don't know. The satellite resolution can't pick up anything else in the area. No other vessels, no aircraft, nothing. Could be a navigation correction. Maybe they spotted an unexpected patrol. For 47 minutes? Ortiz pulled up the track. "Sir, they ran at full speed for almost an hour, covering nearly 30 nautical miles before they disappear off the edge of the satellite's coverage area. That's not evasion. That's flight." Keene stared at the screen. Date Bravo were SEALs. Warriors trained to move toward threats, not away from them. And Holloway had been in enough combat to know the difference between tactical withdrawal and panic. "Where does the track end?" "Here." Ortiz highlighted a section of coast far south of the original mission area, near Socotra Island. Rough water, sea caves, basically unnavigable except at specific tides. "Any signals after that?" "Nothing. It's like they ran to the edge of the world and vanished." Keene pulled out his radio. "Redirect search assets to the Socotra approach. Prioritize coastal cave systems and shallow water anomalies." But even as he gave the order, he knew. They'd found the edge of the mystery, not its solution. By day 17, the search had become a vigil. Keene stood on the Constellation's deck, watching the sun set over water they'd combed so many times he could close his eyes and see the grids. 400 flight hours. 600 miles of coastline inspected meter by meter. Divers had gone into every accessible cave within 50 miles of the last satellite track. Nothing. No debris, no bodies, no fuel slick, no distress beacon, no wreckage caught in nets or washed ashore. It was as if the boat and its crew had been lifted cleanly from the ocean and erased. The chief of naval operations wanted answers. The SEAL community wanted their brothers back. The families wanted anything that proved their loved ones had existed at all. Keene had nothing to give them. He found Ortiz at her station, still scrolling through imagery, though her eyes had the glassy look of someone running on will alone. "Go to bed, Lieutenant." 5 more minutes. "That's an order." She looked up at him, and he saw the same thing he felt. The guilt of stopping when 8 men might still be alive somewhere, and the exhaustion of knowing they almost certainly weren't. "We missed something," Ortiz said. "They didn't just disappear. That's not possible." "I know. So, where are they?" Keene had no answer. In 11 years of Navy service, he'd learned that the ocean kept some secrets forever. He'd just never expected to be standing at the edge of one. The official search was called off at 1400 hours on October 31st, 2002. The announcement went out through channels. All assets reassigned, recovery operations concluded, case status updated to presumed lost at sea. The families would be notified by the end of the day. Arlington would prepare for funerals with empty caskets. Keene signed the final report in the Constellation's wardroom, his hand steady even as his certainty crumbled. The document used words like catastrophic failure and unprecedented circumstances and no evidence of foul play. Careful language that meant they had no idea what had happened. The last paragraph recommended the case remain open for review should new information emerge. Keene set down his pen and looked at the map one final time. 1,200 square miles of nothing. 8 men gone without a trace. And somewhere out there in the dark water, an answer that the Gulf of Aden refused to give up. "God help them," he said to the empty room. Then he closed the file and walked out, leaving Date Bravo to the silence and the sea. The organist at Covenant Naval Chapel in San Diego played Amazing Grace. The same hymn Rome Patterson had hummed before operations, the same tune Marcus Holloway whispered to his infant daughters during midnight feedings. 7 flag-draped caskets lined the altar, each one empty, each one representing a body that had never been recovered from 1,200 square miles of indifferent ocean. Anya Holloway sat in the front pew, her twin daughters asleep against her shoulders. The girls were 4 months old now, heavier than when their father had kissed their foreheads goodbye. They would never remember his voice, never feel his hands lifting them into the air. She stared at the casket bearing his name and tried to comprehend the mathematics of grief. How could she bury a man whose body had simply ceased to exist? Beside her, David Reeves's fiancée clutched a folded tissue, her engagement ring catching the chapel light. They'd planned a June wedding. The invitations had been printed. Now she wore black and held the hand of Reeves's mother, and neither woman could look at the empty casket without seeing the particular cruelty of this moment, all the ritual of death without any of its physical proof. Pastor Elijah Patterson stood at the pulpit. At 57, he'd delivered hundreds of eulogies at his Detroit congregation, but never one for his own son. He wore his ministerial robes and his grief like twin weights, his tall frame slightly stooped as he gripped the edges of the lectern. "I am a man who preaches resurrection," he began, his voice carrying the practiced resonance of decades in the pulpit. "I speak every Sunday about eternal life, about souls ascending, about promises kept beyond the grave." He paused, and the chapel was silent except for muffled crying. "But I stand before you today as a father who cannot hold his son's body, as a man of God who must reconcile faith with the unbearable fact that Jerome, my Rome, rests somewhere beneath waves I will never see, in water I cannot bless, in a place I cannot visit to tell him one more time that I loved him." Anya felt her daughters shift against her. One of them made a small sound and she rocked gently, automatically, performing the motions of motherhood while listening to another parent describe the specific torture of this kind of loss. "The Navy tells me my boy died serving his country," Pastor Patterson continued. "They tell me he was a hero. They give me a medal and a flag, and their solemn promises that everything possible was done." His hands tightened on the pulpit. "But they cannot give me the one thing a father needs. They cannot tell me where he is. They cannot show me his grave. They cannot let me lay my hand on his coffin and know, with certainty, that my son is at rest." Someone in the back pews sobbed openly. Anya recognized her. The mother of one of the other team members, a woman she'd met only once before, during the frantic weeks of searching. Now they were bound together by this absence, this shared inability to complete the basic human ritual of burial. The chaplain had explained it gently. The Navy needed to provide closure for the families. 7 services, 7 caskets, 7 formal acknowledgments of sacrifice. But everyone in this chapel understood the truth. They were burying symbols, burying paperwork, burying the Navy's official conclusion of lost at sea, presumed dead, while the actual men, the bodies, the bones, the physical proof, remained wherever the Gulf of Aden had taken them. Pastor Patterson's voice cracked. "My son loved the water. He told me once before a deployment that he felt closest to God when he was out on the ocean. He said the vastness reminded him that he was part of something bigger than himself." He looked down at his notes, then pushed them aside. "I want to believe that. I want to believe Jerome found peace in those waters, but I am also a father who will never stop wondering. Did he suffer? Did he call for me? Did he know, in his final moments, that I would have moved heaven and earth to reach him if I could?" Anya's daughters stirred again, and this time one began to fuss. She stood quietly, excusing herself to the chapel's side room designated for nursing mothers. Through the door, she could still hear Pastor Patterson's voice, but softer now, filtered through stone walls. She sat in a cushioned chair and adjusted her daughter's position, letting the baby nurse while tears ran silently down her own face. This was her life now. Feeding children who would never know their father, listening to sermons about men who'd vanished into nothing, trying to grieve for someone who might be anywhere or nowhere. The Navy had been so certain. The search commander, a weathered man with kind eyes and a voice full of apology, had explained it during the final briefing. No debris meant catastrophic sinking. No distress calls meant sudden disaster. No bodies meant the ocean had claimed everything, quickly and completely. But Anya had been a cryptologic technician before the twins. She understood probability and pattern analysis. She knew that even catastrophic events left traces. Ships broke apart. Equipment floated. Bodies, awful as it was to consider, eventually surfaced. Date Bravo had left none of that. They'd simply stopped existing at Euro 447 hours on October 28, 2002. Their Arhib's last known position marked on a chart that now sat in a classified file somewhere, a dot on a map that explained nothing. Her daughter finished nursing, and Anya held her against her shoulder, patting her back with practiced rhythm. Through the wall, she heard the congregation singing Eternal Father, Strong to Save, the Navy hymn, the one that begged God to protect those in peril on the sea. For those in peril on the sea. But what if there had been no peril? What if Marcus and his team had simply vanished? What if the ocean itself had opened and swallowed them whole, leaving behind nothing but questions and empty caskets? When she returned to the chapel, the service was concluding. 7 honor guards stood at attention, one beside each flag-draped casket. On command, they lifted the flags, folded them with mechanical precision, and presented them to the families. The officer who gave Anya her flag, Marcus's flag, was young, probably 23 or 24. He handed her the triangle of fabric and recited the words, "On behalf of the President of the United States Navy, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved one's honorable and faithful service." She took it. The flag was heavier than she expected, and she thought about the terrible physics of that. How a piece of cloth could weigh more than the absent body it represented. The burials happened in sequence. Each empty casket was carried to a prepared plot in Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery, overlooking the Pacific. Each family stood and watched as their loved one's symbolic remains were lowered into the ground. Anya stood between the graves of Marcus's parents, her daughters in a stroller beside her. The twins were awake now, staring up at the gray November sky with the unfocused gaze of infants who understood nothing, of death or ceremony, or the howling absence their father had left behind. The rifle salute made them both cry. 7 shots echoing across the cemetery, and then the bugler playing taps while Anya tried to soothe her daughters and watch her husband's empty casket descend into earth that would hold nothing but wood and air, and the formal acknowledgement that Commander Marcus Halloway was gone. Rome Patterson was buried beside him. Then David Reeves. Then the others, one after another, 7 holes in the ground for 7 men whose bodies remained in the sea. Pastor Patterson stood at his son's grave long after the ceremony ended. Anya watched him from a distance, saw him bend slowly and place his hand on the fresh earth, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been a father's private conversation with a son who couldn't hear him. Reeves's fiancée stood at her own grave, the engagement ring glinting as she touched the temporary marker that bore his name. She'd told Anya earlier, in the bathroom before the service, that she couldn't bring herself to return the ring. "It feels like giving up," she'd whispered, "like saying he's really gone." The other families lingered too. Mothers and fathers, siblings and friends, all of them standing over empty boxes and trying to convince themselves this would bring closure. It didn't. Anya knew it wouldn't. You couldn't close grief that had no body, no final moment, no certainty. You could only learn to live beside it, carrying the weight of not knowing. She pushed the stroller back toward the parking area as the cemetery workers began to fill in the graves. Behind her, 7 mounds of earth would mark 7 absences. Headstones would be carved. Names would be etched in granite. Visitors would come and leave flowers and believe they were standing at the place where heroes rested. But Anya would always know the truth. Her husband wasn't here. None of them were. This was just theater, a performance of closure for families who would never truly have it. The weeks that followed blurred into a routine of survival. Anya fed her daughters, changed them, rocked them through nights when she couldn't sleep. She accepted casseroles from neighbors who didn't know what else to offer. She fielded phone calls from Marcus's family, all of them trying to find comfort in the official story while privately harboring the same doubts. The Navy had assigned her a liaison officer, a kind woman who checked in weekly, made sure the benefits were processing correctly, offered referrals to grief counseling. Anya thanked her, but never went. What could a counselor tell her that she didn't already know? That grief was a process? That time would heal? Time didn't heal the not knowing. Time just stretched it out, made it chronic instead of acute. On New Year's Eve, alone in the base housing she'd been allowed to keep for another 6 months, Anya opened Marcus's closet. His uniform still hung there, pressed and precise. His running shoes sat on the floor, salt-stained from morning jogs along the beach. His dress whites, the ones he'd worn to their wedding, waited in a garment bag. She pulled out one of his T-shirts and held it to her face. It still smelled like him. Or maybe that was just the Marine guard at the Sana'a embassy gate knew the face of desperation. He'd seen it on contractors trapped behind enemy lines, on local translators whose cover had been blown, on third-country nationals fleeing tribal vendettas. But the skeletal figure who materialized from the dust-choked street at 14:37 hours on September 18, 2015, carried something different in his hollow eyes. Not fear, but a kind of calculated exhaustion, the look of a man who'd rehearsed this moment in his head 1,000 times. The figure wore local garb gone gray with road grime, a checkered shema draped across scarred shoulders. His feet were wrapped in cloth strips that might once have been sandals. When the Yemeni militia skirmish erupted 3 blocks south, automatic weapons fire crackling through the afternoon heat, he didn't flinch. Just kept walking, slow and deliberate, toward the concertina wire and reinforced barriers that marked the last pocket of American soil in a country tearing itself apart. "English," he rasped at the inner checkpoint, voice like gravel scraped across metal. "I speak English." Lance Corporal DeMarco leveled his M4, standard protocol. His partner, Corporal Chen, radioed for the embassy's regional security officer while keeping her sidearm trained center mass. The afternoon sun baked the compound at 104 degrees. Mortar impacts from the previous night's shelling had left fresh craters in the street beyond the blast walls. The man raised both hands, palms out, movements careful and unthreatening. His Arabic was flawless when he addressed the Yemeni National Guards watching from their secondary post. "I am not armed. I am not a threat. I need to speak to an American officer." DeMarco had been trained at Quantico to assess threats by micro-expressions, body language, weapon tells. This man exhibited none of the markers: no concealed bulk, no nervous sweat despite the heat, no darting eyes seeking targets. Just a bone-deep weariness and something else, the residual posture of military bearing beneath the civilian disguise, visible only to someone who knew what to look for. "State your business," DeMarco ordered, weapon still raised. The man's lips cracked when he attempted a smile. "I'm a United States Navy SEAL. My name is Travis McNeil. Serial number 33827745. I'm from Detachment Bravo, USS Constellation." DeMarco's finger didn't move from outside the trigger guard, but his eyes flicked to Chen. Her expression had shifted from tactical alertness to something approaching shock. "Say again?" "Petty Officer First Class Travis Elias McNeil." The words came slower now, deliberate. "I've been missing since October 2002. I need immediate contact with NCIS or Navy intelligence." Chen's radio squawked. The RSO's voice crackled through. "Hold position. Do not allow entry. Repeat, hold position." But DeMarco was already cataloging details that would appear in his written report 6 hours later. The man's gait suggested old injuries to his left knee and right hip. His hands bore scars consistent with restraint trauma and manual labor. His teeth, visible when he spoke, showed evidence of crude dental work, possibly done without anesthetic. The shemagh slipped when he adjusted his stance, revealing a lattice of scar tissue across his collarbone. Burn marks, maybe, or something worse. "You're telling me," DeMarco said slowly, "that you're the guy from that SEAL team that vanished off Yemen 13 years ago." 14 next month. McNeil's voice carried no plea, no urgency. Just fact delivered with the flat effect of someone beyond emotional manipulation. "I know how this sounds. I know what the file says. I'm legally dead. But I'm here, and I'm real, and I've information that your intelligence directorate needs." The Yemeni militia firefight intensified. Tracer rounds stitched across the twilight sky 3 blocks east. An RPG detonated against a building facade. The pressure wave felt even through the embassy's reinforced perimeter. None of the 3 men at the gate reacted. Chen had her phone out now, scrolling rapidly. There was a SEAL team. October 2002. 8 men lost off the Yemeni coast during counterterrorism ops. I remember. My uncle served on the Constellation. It was all over the Navy Times. 7 men, actually, McNeil corrected quietly. 7 still missing. I'm the 8th. The embassy's inner door opened. The RSO emerged, flanked by 2 diplomatic security agents in full tactical kit, their movements professional and unhurried despite the chaos beyond the walls. Behind them came a figure in civilian clothes, khakis and a button-down that didn't quite conceal the shoulder rig beneath. CIA, DeMarco guessed. The agency maintained a station in Sana'a, even as other Western intelligence services pulled out. The CIA officer stopped 10 feet from the gate, studying McNeil with the dispassionate interest of a collector examining a potentially fraudulent artifact. His name tag read Howell. "You're claiming to be Travis McNeil," Howell said. "Not a question. I'm not claiming anything. I am Travis McNeil." "Then you won't object to biometric verification." "I'd insist on it." Howell nodded to Chen, who approached the gate with a handheld fingerprint scanner, military grade and linked directly to DoD databases. McNeil extended his right hand through the gap in the barrier, fingers steady. The scanner beeped once, twice, then began processing. "What happened to the rest of your team?" Howell asked, conversational. McNeil's jaw worked. "That's a longer conversation, but the short version, we were ambushed 70 clicks inland, traffickers working under Al-Qaeda cover. They scattered us, took most of the team. I got clear during a firefight between rival groups 6 months later." 6 months. And the other 12 years? Staying alive, staying hidden, trying to piece together where they were being held. McNeil's eyes never left Howell's face. "I couldn't surface, couldn't risk leading anyone back to them. I had to work from the shadows, build networks, trade information. You understand how that works. The scanner completed its cycle. Chen glanced at the screen, then looked up at Howell with an expression that conveyed more than words. This was going to require immediate escalation. Howell gestured for her to bring him the device. He read the results twice, his professional detachment cracking just slightly at the edges. "Lance Corporal, open the gate." DeMarco hesitated for half a second. Protocol dictated additional verification, medical screening, security interviews before allowing any non-credentialed person past the outer perimeter, even American citizens. But the look on Howell's face suggested that normal protocols had just been overridden by something much larger. The gate rolled open with a hydraulic hiss. McNeil stepped through, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who'd learned not to make sudden movements around armed guards. The RSO and his team immediately bracketed him, not threatening but absolutely controlling his freedom of movement. "This way," Howell said, leading them toward the embassy's secure core, the reinforced section designed to withstand siege, equipped with its own power and water systems, satellite uplinks, and direct encrypted communications to Langley and the Pentagon. They walked through corridors painted institutional beige, past offices where junior staffers worked behind ballistic glass. The building vibrated slightly from a distant explosion. No one looked up. The debriefing room was windowless, climate-controlled to a sterile 68 degrees, furnished with a metal table bolted to the floor and 4 chairs that had seen better deployments. A camera in the corner transmitted to recording systems and, McNeil assumed, to multiple agencies monitoring in real time. Howell gestured for McNeil to sit. "Medical team is en route. They'll check you over while we talk. You need water? Food? Water would be good." An agent materialized with bottled water, sealed, brand new, the kind that couldn't be tampered with. McNeil broke the seal himself, drank half the bottle in steady swallows that suggested he'd learned to pace hydration in harsh environments. Howell took the chair opposite, placing a tablet on the table between them. Behind him, the RSO and one of the DS agents remained standing, positioned to see both McNeil and the door. "You understand," Howell began, "that this is an extraordinary situation. A man declared KIA 13 years ago walks into an embassy in the middle of a war zone claiming to have survived. You understand the level of verification this is going to require." "I understand." "You also understand that if you're running some kind of con, if you're an impersonator, or if you've been turned and this is an intelligence operation, the consequences will be severe and permanent." McNeil met his eyes without blinking. "I understand that, too. I'm not an impersonator. I'm not playing games. I'm Travis McNeil, and I've spent 14 years trying to stay alive long enough to get my story out." Howell activated the tablet, pulling up what looked like a military service record. "Service number you gave at the gate checks out. Fingerprints match archived personnel files. But let's go deeper. Where were you born?" "Longview, Texas. April 12, 1976. Mother's maiden name?" "Cordero. Sophia Cordero. First duty station after Buds?" "SEAL Team 3, Coronado, 1998. The questions continued, detailed and specific, pulling from classified personnel files and operational histories. McNeil answered each without hesitation, providing details that only the genuine article or someone with extraordinary access to classified systems could know. The nickname of his Buds instructor, the outcome of a disciplinary hearing in 2000, the call sign he'd used during a training exercise in Guam. Through the one-way observation glass that McNeil couldn't see, a CIA analyst sat with a half-eaten sandwich forgotten on his desk, watching the interrogation feed while simultaneously running queries through the agency's most secure databases. Fingerprints had already confirmed identity with 99.97% certainty. Facial recognition software, adjusted for age and malnutrition, showed a 94%. The C-17 Globemaster banked over the Atlantic, cabin lights dimmed to near darkness. Through the porthole windows, dawn was still 3 hours away. Travis McNeil lay strapped to a medical gurney in the cargo bay, an IV line snaking into his left arm. The Navy doctor seated beside him, Lieutenant Commander Price, according to her name tape, adjusted the drip rate and made a notation on her tablet. McNeil's eyes were half closed, his breathing shallow but steady. "Can you hear me, Petty Officer?" Price's voice was clinical, careful. McNeil's head turned slightly. "Yeah." In the forward section of the aircraft, separated by a temporary partition, Navy psychiatrist Commander David Ortega reviewed the preliminary medical reports on his laptop. 47 years old, veteran of countless post-deployment evaluations, he'd seen his share of damaged men. But Travis McNeil's file made him uneasy in ways he couldn't yet articulate. The vitals were straightforward: severe malnutrition, partially healed fractures in the left radius and 3 ribs, dental work that appeared to have been done with veterinary tools. Scars consistent with restraints on wrists and ankles. The body told a story of survival against brutal odds. It was the timeline that bothered him. Ortega closed the medical file and opened the keys. Preliminary transcript from the embassy interview. McNeil claimed 6 months in initial captivity, escape during a firefight, then years of hiding in Yemen's backcountry. But 13 years was a long time to stay hidden. A very long time. Price appeared in the partition doorway. "He's stable enough for questions if you want to start." Ortega gathered his materials and followed her aft. McNeil's eyes tracked him as he approached. The sedation had softened his edges but hadn't erased the calculation Ortega could see working behind those pupils. "Petty Officer McNeil, I'm Commander Ortega. I know you've been through hell, but we need to understand what happened to you and your team." Ortega pulled a folding stool close to the gurney. "Whenever you're ready." McNeil's jaw worked silently for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was a dry rasp. "We were ambushed, inland, maybe 70 clicks from the coast. Tell me about the mission brief, the insertion. Standard recon, coastal surveillance, eyes on a suspected safe house." McNeil's gaze drifted to the curved ceiling of the cargo bay. "We made landfall at EO 500, split into 2 elements. My group, me, Holloway, Reeves, and Patterson, pushed inland to a ridgeline observation point." Ortega made notes on his tablet. "What about the other 4? Security element. Stayed with the boat." McNeil's breathing hitched. "We never made it to the OP. They hit us at dawn. At least 20 fighters, maybe more. Automatic weapons, RPGs. How did they know where you'd be?" A long pause. "Bad intel. Or we were compromised. I don't know." Price checked the IV line as Ortega continued. "You said you were captured. For how long?" 6 months, give or take." McNeil's hand clenched against the restraint strap. "They moved us between compounds. Kept us separated most of the time. I saw Reeves twice, maybe 3 times. Never the others." "What about Lieutenant Commander Holloway?" McNeil's expression flickered, something that might have been grief or might have been performance. "Heard his voice once. Through a wall. He was—" McNeil stopped, swallowed. He was trying to keep someone calm. Rome, I think. Ortega leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about your escape." "February 2003. There was a fight between 2 groups, rival traffickers, fighting over territory or money or God knows what." McNeil's voice gained strength, the narrative flowing more smoothly now. "Explosions, gunfire. The compound went to hell. I got loose from my restraints, made it to a perimeter wall, went over, and just ran." "And your team?" "I tried to get to them. Tried to find where they were being held in the chaos, but the whole place was burning. I had maybe 30 seconds before they'd have killed me. So I ran." Ortega watched McNeil's face as he spoke. The details were vivid, specific, almost rehearsed. "Where did you go?" "Into the mountains. Found a village, traded work for food and shelter. Kept my head down." McNeil's eyes closed. "Spent years moving between settlements, building contacts, trying to find where they'd taken the others." "Why didn't you contact the U.S. government, the embassy?" "Because I thought my team was still alive." McNeil's voice cracked with apparent emotion. "If I surfaced, if I made noise, whoever had them would disappear, or execute them. I couldn't risk it. Price caught Ortega's eye and gave a small shake of her head. Time to wrap up. The patient's vitals were climbing. "We'll continue this at Coronado," Ortega said, standing. "Get some rest, petty officer." McNeil nodded, his eyes already drifting shut as Price adjusted the sedation. Ortega returned to his seat in the forward section and opened a secure satellite link. The face that appeared on screen was younger than his, sharp-featured with short dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Commander, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, JAG. I've been assigned to the McNeil investigation." "Investigation?" Ortega kept his voice neutral. "He's the survivor." "He's a witness to potential war crimes and illegal detention of U.S. service members," Chen corrected. "My job is to document his account and pursue any actionable intelligence." She consulted something off-screen. "I've reviewed the embassy transcript. I'll need to conduct a full debrief once he's stateside and medically cleared." "Understood. Lieutenant, off the record. What's your read on this?" Chen's expression didn't change. "On the record or off, Commander. I deal in evidence. Right now, all I have is one survivor and a lot of missing bodies. I'll form opinions when I have facts." The connection terminated. Ortega sat back and looked at the partition separating him from McNeil. One survivor, 13 years, and a story that fit together almost too neatly. The C-17's engines droned on through the darkness, carrying Travis McNeil home to a country that had buried him 12 years ago. 3 days later, at Naval Base Coronado, McNeil sat in a windowless conference room across from Lieutenant Chen. A digital recorder hummed between them. A Navy paralegal sat in the corner, silent and watchful. "Let's talk about the compound where you were held," Chen said. She slid a satellite photograph across the table. "Can you identify the location?" McNeil studied the image. His finger traced a route through a cluster of buildings. "Here, this was the main holding area, and this—" He tapped a structure near a mosque. "This had a reinforced concrete wall. That's where they interrogated us." Chen made a note without comment. "What can you tell me about your captor's organization?" "Loose network. Trafficking operation using Al-Qaeda rhetoric as cover. They were moving people and weapons through the tribal areas." McNeil's delivery was steady, confident. "The leader went by Abu Rashid. Never saw his face clearly." "And during your years in hiding, you tried to locate your team?" "Every contact I made, every favor I traded, was about finding where they'd been moved." McNeil's hands spread on the table. "I built a network of informants, tea house owners, truck drivers, farmers who moved goods between territories. Someone had to have seen something." "Did anyone?" "Pieces, rumors, men matching their descriptions seen in compounds near Sada or being moved toward the Saudi border." McNeil's jaw tightened. "Nothing I could act on alone. I needed resources, official backup. That's why I finally came in." Chen's pen moved across her legal pad, precise strokes capturing every word. "Walk me through the ambush again. Start from when you left the Arhib." McNeil recounted the same story he'd told Ortega, with identical details. The dawn timing, the ridgeline objective, the overwhelming force. Chen listened without interrupting, her face impassive. "Thank you, petty officer. That's all for today." McNeil blinked. "That's it?" "Initial debrief." Chen gathered her materials. "We'll have follow-up sessions. Get some rest." After McNeil was escorted back to his temporary quarters, Chen returned to her office in the JAG building. She closed the door and pulled up the satellite image McNeil had marked. The mosque he'd indicated was there. So was the compound. But the concrete wall he'd described with such certainty didn't appear in any imagery from 2002 or 2003. She advanced the satellite timeline frame by frame. The wall appeared in a 2007 image, part of a renovation project documented in multiple intelligence reports. Chen sat back in her chair and looked at the notes from McNeil's debrief. Every detail about the compound's layout had been accurate. For 2024, for the Yemen he'd just left, but not for the Yemen of 2002. She opened a secure database and began pulling records. McNeil's escape route, the roads he claimed to have traveled, the villages where he said he'd sheltered. The work took 6 hours. When she finished, the sky outside her window was fully dark. 2 of the roads McNeil described hadn't existed until 2008. 3 of the villages were resettlements built after tribal conflicts in 2011. The tea house he mentioned by name had opened in 2014. Chen printed the timeline discrepancies and pinned them to the corkboard above her desk. Then she pulled McNeil's service record and began reading it again from the beginning, looking for what she might have missed. Outside her office, the base settled into night watch routines. Sentries walked their posts. Ships rocked in their berths. And in Building 432, in a room with reinforced windows and a guard stationed outside, Travis McNeil lay on a government-issue bed and stared at the ceiling. The whiteboard in Sarah Chen's office looked less like evidence and more like the work of obsession. Maps of Yemen. Satellite imagery printed on glossy paper, curling at the edges. Printouts of McNeil's debrief transcripts highlighted in 3 different colors: red for locations, yellow for dates, green for details that didn't add up. She stood before it at Euro 6:30, coffee cooling in her hand, tracing the route McNeil claimed he'd taken after his escape. Her finger moved along Highway 6, the main artery connecting Sana'a to the southern provinces. The road wasn't there in 2003. The construction timeline was publicly available, documented by the Yemeni Ministry of Transport, and later corroborated by UN development reports. Highway 6's southern extension broke ground in 2006, opened in phases between 2008 and 2009. McNeil described traveling it in the immediate aftermath of his supposed escape, using landmarks, a particular bridge, a fuel depot, even a tea house, that didn't exist when he claimed to have seen them. She'd spent the last 48 hours cross-referencing every location he'd mentioned. The pattern was unmistakable. McNeil's testimony described a Yemen that hadn't existed yet when he said he was moving through it. Either his memory was catastrophically corrupted, or he was describing places he'd seen much later. The question was why? Why construct an elaborate deception? Why walk into an embassy 13 years after vanishing and offer a story full of verifiable lies? Her desk phone rang. She let it go to voicemail, eyes still on the board, but her cell buzzed a moment later, Commander Ortega's number. "Chen, we have a problem." Ortega's voice was tight. "McNeil just had his family meeting. Pastor Patterson wants to speak with you. He's waiting outside your office." She found the old man in the hallway, standing with the posture of someone who'd learned patience through decades of ministry but whose eyes carried an urgency that couldn't wait. "Lieutenant Chen." He extended his hand. His grip was firm, deliberate. "Thank you for seeing me." "Of course, Pastor. Would you like to sit?" "I'll stand, thank you. This won't take long." He glanced toward the closed door where McNeil remained with a Navy liaison. "That man in there, he knows things about my son. Personal things. The way Rome would tap his fingers when he was thinking. A joke he made about Detroit winters. Details that are real." Chen waited. She'd learned that silence invited truth. "But he doesn't know my boy." Patterson's voice lowered. "A father knows his child's essence, Lieutenant. The way a soul carries itself. That man? He's performing. He's got the facts, but not the heart behind them. You're looking for a liar." The words settled in the quiet hallway like stones in still water. "What makes you certain?" Patterson considered this. "I watched him tell a story about Rome writing a letter home. The content was accurate. I received that letter. But McNeil described my son's expression wrong. Said Rome was smiling when he wrote it. That letter was about fear, Lieutenant. About facing mortality. Rome wasn't smiling. He was crying." Chen made a note. McNeil could have misremembered. 13 years. He didn't misremember. He never saw it happen. Patterson muttered. Her eyes. Someone told him that story. Someone who witnessed it. But McNeil wasn't there. 3 hours later, Chen sat across from David Reeves's former fiancée in a coffee shop in La Jolla. The woman, Meredith Hayes now, though she'd kept her maiden name professionally, looked older than 43, her face lined with the kind of weathering that grief etches deep. "I wasn't going to call," Meredith said, sliding a letter across the table. "But after I saw the news about McNeil, I thought you should see this." The envelope was postmarked from Djibouti, dated 3 weeks earlier. No return address. Inside, a single piece of paper with 2 sentences written in block letters. "He used to call you Compass because you kept him oriented. He planned to propose at Sunset Cliffs because that's where you first said you loved him." Meredith's hands trembled around her coffee cup. "No one knew about Compass. It was our thing. Private. And he did propose at Sunset Cliffs, but we never told anyone the reason. We just said it was a nice spot." Chen examined the paper. Basic stock, laser printed, untraceable. "McNeil never mentioned this nickname in any debrief?" "Never. And you're certain these details weren't in letters or emails that could have been accessed? The nickname was verbal only. The proposal location is public record, wedding announcements and all that, but the reason—" Meredith shook her head. "David told me the night he proposed. We were alone. He said he'd been planning it for weeks, wanted it to be the exact spot because of what I'd said there." Chen photographed the letter with her phone. "I need to keep this." "Take it. I made copies." Meredith leaned forward. "Lieutenant, David is dead, isn't he? McNeil's story about them being held somewhere. It's not true." Chen chose her words carefully. "I can't discuss an ongoing investigation." "You don't have to. I can see it in your face." Meredith's voice steadied. "I made my peace years ago, but I need you to promise me something. Whoever sent this letter, whoever is playing games with David's memory, you find them, and you make them answer for it." Back in her office, Chen added the letter to her board. She stood back, looking at the full scope of what she'd assembled. McNeil's account had the texture of truth. Specific, detailed, emotionally consistent. But the facts beneath it were rotted through. Roads that didn't exist. Buildings constructed years after he claimed to see them. Intelligence about a trafficking network that perfectly matched CIA reports he shouldn't have accessed. And now this. Someone else out there with intimate knowledge of Date Bravo's final days. Someone who knew details McNeil had never shared. Which meant McNeil wasn't working alone. Or... The alternative crystallized with sudden clarity. McNeil hadn't escaped in 2003. He'd been in Yemen the whole time, living there, moving through it, learning its geography as it developed, its roads, as they were built, its buildings as they rose. He'd described the Yemen he knew, not the Yemen of 2002. But if he'd been there all along, why come forward now? Why risk exposure with a story full of obvious lies? Her phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number. Check the families. More letters coming. He needed them to keep looking. Chen stared at the message. Tried to call the number back. Disconnected. Ran a trace request. Burner phone, last ping from somewhere in East Africa. She pulled up the case files on Date Bravo's families. Started making calls. Holloway's widow Anya confirmed receiving a letter 4 months ago. Specific details about Marcus's habits aboard ship. Things she'd never shared publicly. Rome Patterson's father had gotten 2 letters over the past year. One describing a conversation between Rome and another team member about faith and fear. The pastor had mentioned it during a sermon years ago, but never the specifics. 3 other families reported similar contacts. Always vague enough to seem like memories from a survivor. Always specific enough to feel authentic. Chen laid them out chronologically. The first had arrived in 2019, the most recent 3 weeks ago, just before McNeil surfaced. A pattern emerged. Each letter contained information designed to do one thing. Keep the families invested in the idea that someone out there knew the truth. Keep them pressuring the Navy to investigate. Keep the case alive. McNeil needed the search to continue, because eventually, inevitably, someone would find the cave. And when they did, McNeil's story about trafficking and captivity would seem prescient. He'd be the survivor who escaped and spent years trying to find his team, gathering intelligence, sending breadcrumbs to families because direct contact was too dangerous. He'd be the hero, not the suspect. Chen's phone rang. Commander Ortega. "We have a situation," he said. "McNeil just requested immediate protective custody. Says he's received a credible threat from trafficking networks. Wants to be moved to a secure location tonight." Chen looked at her board, at the evidence of careful manipulation spanning 5 years. "Don't move him. Increase security at his current location, but do not transfer him anywhere until I say otherwise. Sarah, if there's a genuine threat—" "There isn't. He's trying to get ahead of something." She grabbed her jacket. "I'm coming to you. Don't let him out of your sight." She found McNeil in a private room at the base medical facility, ostensibly for a routine physical but clearly agitated. Through the observation window, she watched him pace, check his watch, glance toward the door every 30 seconds. Ortega joined her. "What are we looking at?" "A man who knows his timeline is collapsing." Chen pulled up a satellite image on her tablet, showed it to Ortega. "That geological survey team in the Gulf of Aden? The one doing mineral mapping? They've been posting updates on an academic blog. Their last entry, 2 days ago, mentions anomalous metallic readings in a coastal cave system near Socotra." Ortega went pale. "You think?" "I think McNeil has been monitoring everything related to that region for years, and I think he just realized someone's about to find something he hoped would stay hidden forever." She pushed open the door. McNeil turned, his expression carefully arranged into relieved gratitude. "Lieutenant Chen. Thank God. Did Commander Ortega tell you about the threat? I need to be moved somewhere secure. These people, the network I escaped from, they have resources, contacts. If they know I'm here—" "Sit down, petty officer." Something in her voice stopped him. He sat. Chen placed her tablet on the table between them, satellite image visible. "Tell me about this cave." McNeil looked at the image. His face gave away nothing, but the conference room felt too small for what it was being asked to hold. Marcus Holloway's daughters sat side by side at the polished table, their postures identical, backs straight, hands folded, eyes watchful. 22 years had transformed the infants in their father's wallet photo into women in their mid-20s, and the Navy had done the rest. Both wore civilian clothes for this meeting, but Sarah Chen could spot the bearing a mile away. She'd learned to recognize military families by how they held themselves in rooms designed for bad news. Across from them sat Pastor Elijah Patterson, 86 now, but still formidable, his large hands resting on a worn Bible he'd carried from Detroit. His eyes were the color of lake water in winter. And at the head of the table, freshly showered and dressed in casual clothes that someone had provided, sat Travis McNeil. Chen watched from the observation room next door, a Navy psychologist named Dr. Raymond Torres standing beside her. The one-way mirror gave them a perfect view. Torres held a tablet, ready to annotate every micro-expression, every pause, every word. "He's had 2 days to prepare for this," Torres murmured. "Let's see what he's rehearsed." Through the glass, McNeil's face arranged itself into something appropriately solemn. He looked at the Holloway sisters, Emma and Claire. Chen had learned their names, and his voice was rough with manufactured emotion. "I don't even know where to start," he said. "Your father was... he was the best of us, the absolute best." Emma Holloway's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Claire reached over and took her sister's hand. McNeil continued, and Chen had to admit he was good. He recounted training exercises with the kind of specific detail that felt authentic. Marcus Holloway insisting on an extra safety check before a fast rope drill, his habit of checking every man's gear personally before insertion, the way he'd hum hymns when he was thinking through a problem. "Amazing grace," McNeil said, shaking his head with a sad smile. "Always amazing grace." Used. To drive Chief Reeves crazy during the long waits. But your dad said it kept him centered, reminded him what he was fighting for. Claire Holloway's eyes glistened. Emma's remained dry. "Do you remember what he talked about?" Emma asked. Her voice was steady, professional. "Before missions, I mean. What was on his mind?" McNeil didn't hesitate. "You two. Always you two. He had that picture. You know the one, and he'd look at it every single time before we went out. Called you his compass home. Said no matter how dark things got, he just had to think about getting back to you and your mom." Chen saw Torres make a note. The detail was accurate. The photo, the ritual. But something in the delivery felt rehearsed. Pastor Patterson had remained quiet, his weathered face unreadable. Now he leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about my son," he said. "Tell me about Rome." McNeil turned to him, and Chen watched the recalibration happen in real time. Different audience, different performance. "Jerome was the conscience of the team, sir," McNeil said, using the formal first name. "Always checking in on everyone, making sure we stayed sharp. He talked about you all the time, about growing up in the church, about how you taught him that service was sacred, whether it was to God or country." Patterson's expression didn't change. "What did he fear?" The question landed like a trap, and for a fraction of a second McNeil's composure flickered. "Sir?" "Every man fears something," Patterson said quietly. "Even brave men, especially brave men because they know what they're walking into." "What did my son fear?" McNeil recovered quickly. "Letting the team down, I think. He was young, wanted to prove himself. He'd get quiet before operations, real focused. I think he was afraid of making a mistake that might put someone else at risk." In the observation room, Chen heard Torres draw a sharp breath. She glanced at him. "That's wrong," Torres whispered. "According to the psychological profiles we pulled from his service record, Patterson's primary anxiety wasn't about operational performance. It was about writing letters home," Chen finished, remembering something Pastor Patterson had told her in an earlier interview. He was afraid his father would read fear between the lines. He'd obsess over every word, making sure he sounded brave enough. Through the glass, Pastor Patterson was nodding slowly at McNeil's answer, but his eyes had gone distant, like he was looking at something far beyond the room. The meeting continued for another hour. McNeil delivered memory after memory, each one pitched perfectly to its audience. He spoke of David Reeves's dry humor, his meticulous care with explosives, his excitement about his upcoming wedding. He recounted shared meals in the mess, liberty in port cities, the particular camaraderie of men who trusted each other with their lives. When it was over, the Holloway sisters stood and shook McNeil's hand. Emma's grip was firm, professional. Claire's lingered a moment longer. "Thank you," Claire said, her voice thick. "It helps, knowing he wasn't alone at the end, that he had his team." McNeil's eyes glistened convincingly. "He was a father to all of us, ma'am. I wish I could have brought him home." The sisters left, Claire leaning slightly on Emma as they walked out. Chen made a note to have someone check on them. Pastor Patterson rose more slowly, his joints stiff. He moved around the table and extended his hand. McNeil took it, and the old man held it for a long moment, his grip surprisingly strong. "God bless you, son," Patterson said. "I'm grateful you survived to tell us these things." Then he released McNeil's hand and walked toward the door, but he paused at the threshold, turned back and looked at McNeil with an expression Chen couldn't quite read. "You know their stories," Patterson said softly. "You know them well." McNeil nodded. "Yes, sir. We lived together, deployed together. But you don't have their souls," Patterson continued, as if McNeil hadn't spoken. "You speak the words, you hit the notes, but there's no music in it." The room went very still. "Sir," McNeil said carefully. Patterson stepped back into the room, and despite his age, there was something imposing about him. "My son feared disappointing me in his letters, not in his work. He never once worried about letting the team down. He knew he was good at his job, but those letters, he'd write them 4, 5 times, choosing every word like it was a prayer, terrified I'd read the truth of how scared he sometimes was. That's what kept him up at night, not operational failure, parental disappointment. McNeil's face remained neutral, but Chen saw his left hand curl into a fist beneath the table. "It's a small thing," Patterson said, his voice still quiet but carrying the weight of certainty. "The kind of detail you'd miss if you were working from second-hand accounts, from stories someone told you, from reports you'd read." He turned and walked out without another word. In the observation room, Torres was making rapid notes. "Did you see his reaction? The micro-expression when—" "I saw it," Chen said. She was already moving toward the door. She caught up with Pastor Patterson in the hallway outside. He was moving slowly toward the exit, and when he heard her footsteps, he turned. "Lieutenant Chen," he said, "you've been kind to let an old man ramble." "You're not rambling, sir," Chen said. "You're testifying." His eyes met hers, and she saw the absolute conviction there. "That man knows my son's stories, Lieutenant," he said quietly. "But he doesn't have his soul. You're looking for a liar." "I know," Chen said. Patterson nodded once, satisfied. "Then I'll pray for you, for wisdom, and for justice." He paused. "They're not always the same thing, but in this case I believe they might be." He walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Chen stood there for a moment, then pulled out her phone and called her FBI liaison. He answered on the first ring. "I need full surveillance on McNeil," she said, 24/7. "And I need the forensic linguistics team to analyze the family letters against his debrief transcripts. Every word, every phrase, every syntactic pattern." "You think he wrote them?" "I think he wrote some of them," Chen said, watching through the hallway window as McNeil was escorted back to his quarters. "And I think whoever wrote the rest might be the key to everything." She thought of Pastor Patterson's words, stories without souls, performance without truth. "Get me everything," she said. "We're running out of time." The storm hit without warning. Silas Redwood watched the sky darken through the bridge windows of the Prosperity, a 72-foot survey vessel that had been his home for the past 3 months. The weather forecast from Djibouti had not mentioned this. A sudden squall, rolling in from the northeast, the kind that turned calm Indian Ocean waters into a meat grinder in minutes. "Secure everything," he shouted to his crew, 3 Somali nationals he had hired through a marine services company in Mogadishu. Good men. Experienced. But even experience meant nothing when the sea decided to remind you who was in charge. The first wave hit like a fist. Silas gripped the console as the Prosperity pitched 40 degrees to port. Coffee mugs became projectiles. Charts slid across the navigation table. Through the spray-covered windows he could barely see 30 feet ahead. Just gray water and darker gray sky bleeding together into a smear of violence. Engines running rough. Ahmed, the engineer, called up from below deck. His English was accented but clear, honed by years working international vessels. Fuel filters clogged. Too much sediment from the last refuel. Of course it was. They had topped off in a fishing village 2 days ago, pumping diesel from drums that probably predated the Somali Civil War. Silas had known better, but the nearest proper marina was 200 nautical miles south, and the survey deadline did not care about best practices. Another wave. This one came from starboard, slamming the boat sideways and sending Silas into the bulkhead hard enough to taste blood. His clipboard clattered across the deck, scattering bathymetric readings and core sample logs into the bilge water now sloshing across the floor. "We need shelter." Hassan, the first mate, gripped the helm with both hands, fighting to keep the bow pointed into the waves. He was 50-something, weathered as driftwood, and Silas had watched him navigate coastlines that would have made most captains refuse the job. If Hassan looked worried, things were bad. "Nearest harbor?" Silas wiped blood from his split lip with the back of his hand. Hassan checked the GPS, shook his head. 30 kilometers south. We will sink before we make it." The Prosperity shuddered as another swell rolled beneath them. Somewhere below, Silas heard the sharp crack of something breaking loose. The sonar equipment, probably. There went 3 weeks of mapping data and $40,000 in hardware. "There!" Mahmoud, the youngest of the crew at 26, pointed toward the coastline barely visible through the storm. The caves! Silas squinted through the rain-streaked glass. He had surveyed this stretch of Yemeni coast for 2 months, using magnetometer sweeps and side-scan sonar to map underwater mineral deposits for a Dutch mining consortium. He knew every ridge, every drop-off, every volcanic formation that made this water treacherous. The caves Mahmoud meant were technically sea caves, pockets carved into the limestone cliffs by millennia of erosion, accessible only during the lowest tides. They appeared on charts as hazards to avoid, shallow-draft death traps that could crush a boat against stone if you timed the tide wrong. But Hassan was already turning the wheel. "The storm surge will give us enough depth," the first mate said, more to himself than anyone, "and when it recedes, we will be trapped inside until the next tide cycle," Silas finished. 12 hours, maybe more, wedged in a cave with no communication, no rescue option, and structural damage they could not assess until the water calmed. Hassan looked at him. Rain hammered the roof. The engine coughed, stuttered, nearly died. "It is shelter or swimming," Hassan said. Silas nodded. "Make for the caves." The Prosperity limped toward the cliffs, engine misfiring, hull groaning with every wave. Silas had navigated difficult waters before, surveying off Alaska's Aleutian chain, mapping Arctic shelves where ice could shear your propeller in seconds. But this felt different. The storm had come too fast, too focused, as if something wanted them specifically off course. He shook the thought away. Occupational hazard of spending too much time alone with geological data, you started attributing intention to natural phenomena. Through the storm, the cliff face materialized. Limestone, pocked with erosion holes like a diseased face. Waves crashed against stone with enough force to send spray 30 feet into the air. And there, just above the waterline during the surge peaks, a darkness that suggested depth. "Cut the engine," Hassan shouted. "Ahmed, killed it." The sudden silence was worse than the noise, just wind and water and the terrifying sound of their boat being pushed toward rock by forces they could not control. Hassan used the rudder for the last bit of steering, riding the surge like a surfboard, timing it perfectly. The Prosperity's bow slipped into shadow. The cave mouth swallowed them with a wet gasp. Mahmoud fired up the emergency spotlight. The beam cut through darkness, illuminating walls slick with algae and barnacles. The cave was bigger than Silas expected, 30 feet wide, maybe more, extending back into the cliff like a throat. The water inside was calmer, protected from the worst of the wind, but the echo made every sound harsh and metallic. "We are in," Hassan said, his voice shaking slightly. Relief or adrenaline or both. Silas grabbed a handheld depth finder, checked the readout. 11 feet of water beneath them now, but the tide was already dropping. In an hour, they would be sitting on bottom. He hoped it was sand. Prayed it was not sharp volcanic rock that would puncture their hull. "Deploy the bilge pump," he told Ahmed. "Make sure we are not taking on water. Hassan, check for damage to the rudder and prop. Mahmoud, get the emergency beacon set up. If we can get a signal bounce off the cave entrance during transmission windows, someone might—" Silas. Mahmoud's voice was strange, tight. Silas turned. The young Somali stood at the bow, spotlight aimed deeper into the cave, his free hand gripping the rail with white-knuckle force. "What is it?" Mahmoud did not answer, just adjusted the beam, and Silas saw it, something metallic, flat surfaces where there should only be stone. Covered in marine growth, yes, but the shape underneath was unmistakable. Angular, manufactured, wrong for a place untouched by human presence for millennia. He moved to the bow on legs that felt suddenly unsteady. His mind, trained to process geological anomalies, tried to categorize what he was seeing. Shipwreck, maybe. Smuggler's cache. Military debris from one of Yemen's endless conflicts. But as Mahmoud swept the light across it, Silas's breath caught. It was a boat. Not ancient, not rusted iron or rotted wood. Modern. Military grade. A rigid hull inflatable boat. Its gray fabric sponsons mostly intact beneath the barnacles, the rigid fiberglass hull wedged against the cave's back wall, like it had been driven there deliberately. 22 feet long, twin outboards, and on the starboard side, partially obscured but still visible once you knew to look for it, U.S. military markings. Should we check it? Ahmed had joined them, his engineer's curiosity overriding caution. Silas grabbed a handheld radio, keyed it, even though he knew the signal would not penetrate the cave to reach the emergency frequencies. Habit. Protocol. The things you did when your brain was trying to process the impossible. He looked at Hassan. The first mate was staring at the derelict boat with an expression Silas could not read. Not fear, exactly. Something older. Local stories, Hassan said quietly, talk about this stretch of coast. The caves that scream when the tide comes in. The place where the Americans went to die. Stories, Silas repeated. But his geologist's mind was already working. Marine growth patterns suggested the boat had been here for years, decades, maybe. The way it was positioned, nose first into the narrowest part of the cave like something had chased it in. "We should document this," Ahmed said. "Take photos. It could be—" "Worth money?" Mahmoud asked. His hand had drifted to the knife on his belt, the unconscious gesture of a man who had survived Somali waters long enough to know salvage rights were written in blood as often as law. "Worth reporting," Silas corrected. He pulled out his waterproof camera, hands steady despite the adrenaline now flooding his system. "This is a U.S. military vessel. That means it is their property, their jurisdiction, their—" He stopped. Through the viewfinder, zooming in on the boat's stern, he could make out more details. Hull number, partial serial code, and something else that made his stomach drop. The hatches were sealed. Dogged shut from the inside, the kind of watertight security you implemented when you were trying to keep something out, or keep something in. Silas lowered the camera. Outside, the storm was weakening, reduced to rain and distant thunder. The tide continued its retreat, dropping an inch every few minutes. Soon they would be grounded, stuck here until the sea decided to release them, and 10 feet away, close enough to touch if he wanted, was a boat that had been missing for longer than Mahmoud had been alive. "Take pictures," Silas said. "Every angle, every detail, and nobody touches that boat until we can contact the authorities." Ahmed and Mahmoud exchanged looks but did as ordered, moving carefully across the Prosperity's deck with cameras and phones. Hassan remained at the helm, engine key in hand, ready to fire up and flee if the tide allowed. Silas aimed his spotlight at the derelict's main hatch. The metal was corroded, green with oxidation, but the dogs, the heavy latches that sealed it, were clearly engaged. From inside, he thought about the geological surveys he had been running. 3 months mapping this coastline with sonar and magnetometer, searching for mineral deposits and tectonic anomalies. They had passed this cave dozens of times. The forensics team worked in the kind of silence reserved for catacombs. Inside the sealed Arhib, halogen floods turned the cave into an operating theater of harsh shadows and stark revelation. Senior Chief Petty Officer Vincent Marquez, 17 years with Naval Criminal Investigative Service, moved through the compartment with the practiced delicacy of a man who understood that bodies tell stories long after voices fail. 7 of them, still in tactical gear, positioned like sentries who'd died at their posts. "Document everything," Marquez murmured into his throat mic, though his team needed no reminder. Every surface, every position, every detail was being photographed from a dozen angles, while the cave's unique microclimate, stable temperature, minimal tidal intrusion, protection from scavengers, had preserved what the open ocean would have erased in weeks. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Halloway sat slumped over the communications console, headphones still cradled against what remained of his skull, one hand frozen on the transmit button. His dog tags hung visible against the decay of his tactical vest, catching the lights like a small, deliberate accusation. Chief Petty Officer David Reeves was positioned near the weapons locker, which stood open. 3 M4 carbines were missing. His body faced the sealed forward hatch, hands placed as if he'd been gripping something that was no longer there. Petty Officer Jerome Patterson occupied the navigation station, charts spread before him in a careful fan. The GPS unit's screen was dark, battery long dead, but his last plotted coordinates were still visible on the waterproof chart, a position approximately 400 yards from their current location. The others formed a defensive perimeter around the cabin's interior, facing outward, watching approaches that had never materialized. "Chief?" Specialist Angela Torres, the team's forensic photographer, stood at the stern bulkhead, her camera lowered. Her voice carried a tremor Marquez had never heard before. "You need to see this." He moved carefully around Patterson's remains, the decades-old tactical boots making soft impressions in the sediment that had seeped through microscopic gaps over 22 years. Torres's flashlight illuminated the interior hull. Words. Written in what appeared to be dried blood, the letters irregular but deliberate, each stroke a conscious effort against whatever terror had seized the writer's mind. "Don't let them in." Marquez stared at the message for a long moment, his forensic training warring with the visceral impact of those 4 words. The handwriting matched samples they'd recovered from Holloway's personnel file, the same compact precision, the same slight right slant. "Take samples for analysis," he said quietly. "Document the exact positioning, measure each letter, cross-reference with writing exemplars." "Already on it, Chief." Torres's hands were steady as she worked, but her jaw was set tight. Behind them, the medical examiner was conducting preliminary assessments, his gloved hands moving with clinical efficiency across remains that had waited more than 2 decades for this examination. "No obvious signs of trauma," Dr. Raymond Cho reported, his voice deliberately neutral. "No bullet wounds, no blast injuries, no evidence of physical combat. Initial assessment suggests death occurred from asphyxiation, but I'll need lab analysis to confirm." "Suicide pact?" Torres asked, her camera clicking steadily. "Negative." Cho gestured to the sealed hatches. "Look at their positioning. They're not resigned. They're defensive. Whatever they were afraid of, they believed it was outside this boat." Marquez moved to the communications station, crouching beside Holloway's body. The radio equipment was intact, well-maintained, protected by the same climate that had preserved the bodies. The frequency dial was set to the emergency channel. The transmit button was pressed so hard that Holloway's finger bones had left permanent impressions in the rubber coating, trying to call for help until the very end. "Chief, we've got something else." Torres had moved to the starboard bench, where a waterproof equipment case sat wedged beneath the seat. She opened it carefully, revealing a small video camera in a military-grade protective housing. Marquez felt his pulse quicken. "Is it intact?" "Looks like it." Torres extracted the camera with the reverence of someone handling a religious artifact. "Battery's dead, but the housing's sealed. If the storage card survived—" "Bag it priority 1, Marquez interrupted. "That goes straight to the lab. No stops, no delays." He stood, surveying the scene with the systematic attention that made him exceptional at a job most people couldn't stomach. Emergency rations unopened in their vacuum packs, medical supplies still sealed in their kit. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 of a tank. Every detail contradicted the obvious conclusion. This wasn't a team that had run out of options. This was a team that had chosen to seal themselves in a tomb. "Get samples of everything," he ordered. "Water from the bilge, residue from surfaces, air quality readings from the sealed compartment. I want to know what they breathed, what they drank, what might have been in their systems." "You think they were drugged?" Cho asked. "I think they were terrified," Marquez replied, "and I want to know why." 3 days later, in a windowless conference room at Naval Base Coronado, Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood before a secure video screen, facing a panel of admirals whose collective stars could have filled a small constellation. "Timeline is absolute," she said, using a laser pointer to highlight the forensic report projected behind her. "Detachment Bravo sealed themselves in that cave in October 2002. Carbon dating of the biological materials, corrosion patterns on the equipment, sediment analysis, everything confirms they never left that location. They died within 72 hours of their last radio contact. Admiral Harkness leaned forward. Cause of death? Asphyxiation. Chen advanced to the next slide, displaying the toxicology results. But here's where it gets complicated. All 7 bodies showed elevated levels of a synthetic hallucinogenic compound, military grade, not naturally occurring. Effects include extreme paranoia, vivid visual and auditory hallucinations, and acute fear responses. Poisoned? Admiral Chen asked. Deliberately, Sarah confirmed. The compound was found in the desalination unit's output reservoir, but the concentration suggests it was introduced manually, not through equipment malfunction. Someone put it there. She paused, letting that sink in. McNeil, Admiral Harkness said flatly. McNeil. Chen advanced to a new slide. The Arhib's interior, the defensive positions, the message scrawled on the hull. They were experiencing shared delusions, likely seeing threats that weren't there. They fled their operational area at full speed. Satellite imagery confirms that, and found refuge in the cave. Then they sealed themselves in, believing something was trying to get to them. And McNeil? Chen pulled up a map, marking coordinates. His remains were found 3 miles inland, exact location recorded in the boat's log. He died from exposure and dehydration approximately 5 days after leaving the cave, long enough to carve a message into rock before he expired. The screen showed a photograph. Weathered stone, barely legible letters. We saw the ships. They saw us. Run. Ships? Admiral Cartwright frowned. What ships? Unknown. Chen's voice carried the frustration of incomplete answers. But here's the critical detail. The video camera we recovered had 37 minutes of footage. It's damaged, corrupted in places, but what we can see matches everything else. 8 men, severely compromised, paranoid, hallucinating. They thought they were being pursued. She pressed play on a clip. The footage was grainy, timestamp reading 0523 hours on October 15th, 2002. Holloway's face filled the frame, haggard and wild-eyed, speaking directly to the camera with desperate urgency. If anyone finds this, whatever McNeil told you, it's not what it looks like. He put something in the water. We all drank it. I can see. He stopped, looking past the camera at something off-frame. Christ, they're back. The camera swung wildly, showing the sealed hatch. Someone was pounding on it from inside. The sound of fists against metal, of men demanding to be let out or kept in. The audio too distorted to determine which. Holloway's voice again, barely audible. Don't let them in. Don't let them... Static. Chen stopped the playback. McNeil poisoned his own team, she said. Current theory, he was selling intelligence, planning to defect, needed them incapacitated long enough to escape. But the drug worked too well. Instead of sedation, it caused psychosis. They turned on each other, or believed something else was turning on them, and sealed themselves in that cave waiting for threats that existed only in their minds. And McNeil? He either took a smaller dose or had some kind of tolerance. Functional enough to flee the boat, not functional enough to survive the desert. His message about ships? Hallucination. There were no other vessels in the area. We verified satellite data going back to the original search. Admiral Harkness's jaw tightened. Where is McNeil now? Witness Protection House in Oregon, Chen replied. He's being monitored, but he doesn't know we found the cave yet. I've arranged for a controlled disclosure. Show him photos, gauge his reaction. Do it. Harkness leaned back. And Chen? When this goes public, the families deserve the truth. All of it. Travis McNeil sat in the living room of a ranch house outside Portland, watching afternoon light filter through blinds that never fully opened. The television murmured news he didn't process. The coffee in his hand had gone cold an hour ago. The knock on the door was expected. The marshals assigned to his protective detail maintained a rigid schedule. But when he opened it, Sarah Chen stood flanked by 2 FBI agents in tactical gear. Lieutenant McNeil, she said, using his rank like a weapon. "We need to talk." They didn't arrest him, not yet. They walked him to his own dining table and laid out photographs like a dealer, revealing a fatal hand. The cave, the boat, the bodies. McNeil's face remained still, carefully neutral, but Chen saw it, the micro-expression that lasted a fraction too long. The interrogation room at Naval Base Coronado smelled of industrial disinfectant and recycled air. Travis McNeil sat at the bolted-down table, hands folded, spine straight despite 48 hours in federal custody. The confident survivor who'd walked into the Sana'a embassy 9 years ago had calcified into something harder. His lawyer, a Navy JAG captain assigned by the government, sat beside him reviewing notes he'd already reviewed 3 times. The door opened without warning. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen entered alone. Not the team of prosecutors McNeil had been bracing for. Not the FBI agents who'd arrested him at his witness protection apartment in Eugene. Just Chen, carrying a single manila folder thick enough to suggest finality. She set it on the table between them. The sound echoed in the small room. "The lies end today, petty officer." McNeil's lawyer shifted. "Commander Chen, my client has been cooperative throughout." "Your client," Chen interrupted, her voice precise as a scalpel, "has been performing for 9 years." She opened the folder, extracting a photograph. The Arib, wedged in the cave, barnacles thick on its hull. "But we found the stage." McNeil's eyes settled on the image. Something flickered across his face, too fast to name. Chen laid out more photos. 7 bodies in tactical gear. Holloway slumped over the communications console, the blood-written warning on the hull. October 2002. They died in that cave 22 years ago, while you were... Where exactly? My client's account of his captivity is documented. In intelligence reports he read after returning to the States. Chen slid another document forward. Toxicology confirmed synthetic hallucinogens in all 7 bodies, not naturally occurring, not from contaminated water. She tapped the report. A compound that requires laboratory synthesis and very specific knowledge to obtain. McNeil's jaw tightened. "We found your contacts in Yemen," Chen continued. "The smuggling network you'd been cultivating for 6 months before the mission. The cryptocurrency accounts you set up in 2001. The plan was elegant, really. Poison the team just enough to incapacitate them. Stage a disappearance. Sell what you knew to the highest bidder and vanish into Southeast Asia with $2 million. The lawyer's pen stopped moving. "But the dosage was wrong," Chen said. "Or the team's physiology was different. Then you calculated. They didn't pass out. They hallucinated. They panicked." She pulled out printouts from the recovered video. "They hunted you, didn't they? Into that cave." McNeil's fingers pressed white against the table. "You sealed them in because you couldn't control them anymore. You waited outside while they used up their oxygen, while Holloway tried to radio for help that would never come, while they wrote their final message, not knowing the real threat was already gone." "This is speculation," the lawyer said, but his voice had lost its authority. Chen extracted a USB drive. "Forensic linguistics analyzed your debrief transcripts against the letters sent to families between 2015 and 2024. The sentence structures match, the micro-patterns and phrasing. You wrote those letters to yourself, didn't you? To keep pressure on the Navy, to make sure someone would eventually find that cave and validate your trafficking story." She leaned forward. "You needed to be the hero who survived, who kept searching, who never gave up on his brothers." Her voice dropped. "But they ruined it by writing the truth on the hull before they died." Silence filled the room like rising water. McNeil's lawyer cleared his throat. "I need to consult with my client." "Your client," Chen said, "is looking at 8 counts of premeditated murder, conspiracy, espionage, and fraud. The evidence is airtight: DNA, video, toxicology, financial forensics, witness testimony from Yemen." She closed the folder. "The only question left is whether he wants this to go to trial, where every family member will have to sit through months of testimony hearing exactly how their loved ones died." or whether he confesses now, spares them that, and accepts the inevitable. McNeil stared at the photograph of the cave. His breath came slow, measured. "I want immunity," he said finally. "No? Then a plea agreement. Life with parole consideration after—" "You'll die in prison," Chen said flatly. "The only choice you have is between dying as a coward who made families suffer through a trial, or dying as a coward who at least told the truth." The lawyer looked at his client. McNeil's hands were trembling now, the only crack in his composure. 23 hours a day in segregation, Chen continued. That's what traitors get at Leavenworth. You'll have 1 hour for recreation, alone, because even murderers have standards about what you did. McNeil's jaw worked silently. "Tell me what happened," Chen said. "All of it." Minutes passed. The air conditioning hummed. Somewhere in the building, a door closed with a distant bang. "They weren't supposed to die," McNeil whispered. Chen waited. "It was supposed to be. Just enough to knock them out. 4 hours, maybe 6. Long enough for me to make the coast. To disappear." His voice was hollow. "I had buyers. Real buyers. Intel on SEAL protocols. Classified positions. I'd been setting it up for a year. The smuggling network. They promised extraction, new identity. The money was already in escrow." He rubbed his face. "But the compound, I got it from a Yemeni chemist. He said it was reliable, tested. I put it in the desalination unit 3 hours before we launched. And they started acting strange around Euro 400, paranoid, seeing things. Holloway thought—" He stopped. "They thought there were boats pursuing us, ships that weren't there. Reeves wanted to engage. Rome was trying to transmit warnings to the constellation." Chen's expression didn't change. "I realized it was wrong. The dose, the compound, something. They were supposed to just sleep. Instead, they were—" He gestured helplessly. "Hunting. They thought I was compromised, that I'd been turned. They cornered me near that cave system. So you led them inside. I thought if I could get them into enclosed space, contain them until it wore off." His voice cracked. "They followed me in, and then Reeves sealed the hatch from inside. He thought we were protecting ourselves from the enemy, from the hallucinated ships. And you were outside." "Yes." "How long did you wait?" McNeil's eyes closed. 18 hours, until I couldn't hear anything anymore, until the tide came in and covered the entrance." "Did you try to open the hatch?" "It was dogged from inside. I couldn't." "You didn't try very hard." He looked at her then, and something sharp flickered in his gaze. "What was I supposed to do? Call the Navy? Tell them I'd poisoned my team? They would have saved them," Chen finished. "A medevac could have reached that position in 90 minutes. Emergency breathing equipment could have been airdropped. But you'd have to explain why they were hallucinating. Why you weren't." McNeil said nothing. "So you left them to die, took what intel you could carry, and disappeared into Yemen's highlands. The buyers never paid. The network collapsed. I was stranded. For 13 years, until you realized the case had gone cold, until you thought you could come back as a hero instead of a traitor. I thought if I could find the others, if I could—" "There were no others!" Chen's voice cracked like a whip. "You knew exactly where they were. You sealed them in that cave yourself and listened to them die." The lawyer started to speak, but McNeil raised a hand. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I did." The confession hung in the air, stark and final. Chen pulled out a legal pad. "I want every detail. Every contact in Yemen. Every dollar you were promised. Every lie you told the families." She clicked her pen. "And I want to know why you sent those letters. Why you tortured them for 9 more years when you already had everything you needed." McNeil's smile was bitter. "Because I needed someone to find the cave. Someone had to discover them so my story would be validated. The trafficking network. The years in hiding. All of it." He leaned back. "The families were necessary. Their pressure kept the investigation warm." Chen's hand tightened on the pen, but her voice stayed level. "You used their grief as cover. I used whatever I had. Did you feel anything when you sent those letters?" "I felt—" McNeil considered. Efficient? The lawyer looked sick. Chen wrote for a long moment. Then she stood. A prosecutor will be here in 20 minutes to take your formal statement. You'll repeat everything you just told me on record. Then you'll be transferred to pretrial custody. When's the trial? There won't be one. You just confessed. She gathered her folder. The families will be notified tomorrow. They'll finally know the truth about what happened to their sons, their husbands, their fathers. She reached the door. Commander. Chen paused. They really weren't supposed to die, McNeil said again, and this time his voice carried something that might have been regret or might have been self-pity. They ruined everything. Chen looked at him over her shoulder. No, petty officer. They died as warriors. They died protecting each other from a threat they couldn't understand. She opened the door. You're the only thing ruined here. The door closed behind her with the finality of a vault ceiling. In the hallway, Chen leaned against the wall, exhaling slowly. Her hands weren't quite steady. Through the one-way glass, she could see McNeil sitting motionless at the table, staring at the photograph of 7 bodies in a cave that had become their tomb. 22 years, 7 families, and a traitor who'd almost gotten away with it. She pushed off the wall and headed toward the office. Travis McNeil slipped the first protective detail on a Tuesday afternoon, during the scheduled rotation change at the safe house in Pendleton, Oregon. The tail car arrived at 14:07 instead of 1400, 7 minutes late because the driver stopped for coffee at a Starbucks on Highway 395. 7 minutes was all McNeil needed. He walked out the back door carrying a gym bag and wearing a Carhartt jacket that belonged to one of his handlers, left draped over a kitchen chair. The surveillance cameras captured his exit, but the alert wouldn't trigger until the next detail ran the routine perimeter check at 14:30. By then, he was 3 miles away in a Honda Civic registered to a woman who'd died in Boise 2 years prior, keys taped under the wheel well since March. The desert unrolled before him in shades of rust and bone. McNeil drove precisely at the speed limit, hands at 10 and 2, a man unremarkable in every observable way. The radio murmured NPR coverage of a water rights dispute in New Mexico. He changed stations to classic rock. Eagles. Hotel California. He hummed along. In the gym bag. $42,000 in bundled 20s, 3 driver's licenses from different states, 2 passports with entry stamps from countries he'd never visited, and a prepaid phone with exactly 1 number programmed. He hadn't called it yet. Wouldn't, unless the plan collapsed entirely. The plan wouldn't collapse. He'd run scenarios for 9 years, since the moment in 2015 when he understood that returning as a survivor was his only viable exit from Yemen's slow death. He'd anticipated exposure, prepared for it. The cave's discovery had accelerated the timeline by perhaps 6 months, but the fundamentals held. False identity established. Route memorized. Vehicle staged. Money laundered through enough shell accounts that even Treasury forensics would need weeks to trace it. By the time Sarah Chen signed the warrant, he'd be in Nogales. By the time they alerted border stations, he'd be through. By the time they activated Interpol protocols, he'd be someone else entirely in a country with no extradition treaty and officials who valued cash over cooperation. The highway stretched empty through high desert scrubland. Sagebrush and telephone poles. A truck stop at exit 47, where he refueled and bought a bottle of water from a clerk who never looked at his face. Back on the road, southbound on I-5, the odometer ticking toward the California border. He thought about the interrogation with Chen, her methodical voice, the photographs spread across the table like cards in a rigged game, the forensic timeline she'd built, airtight and unanswerable. She'd been good, better than he'd expected, but she'd also been bound by procedure, by the need for confession and documentation. McNeil had given her both. Not from remorse, he felt none, but because confession served his purpose. Let them have their story. Let the families have their closure. Let Chen have her promotion. He'd be gone before the prosecution brief reached a courtroom. The mistake they made was assuming he'd stay put. That protective custody meant protection from external threats, not recognition that he himself was the threat. Arizona announced itself with a sign at the state line and a sudden shift in the landscape's palette. Deeper reds, sharper shadows. McNeil merged into sparser traffic. 18-wheelers hauling freight toward Phoenix. Families in minivans returning from California vacations. A motorcycle club riding in formation, their engines a distant growl. He stopped for gas outside Yuma, paid cash, used the restroom, studied his reflection in the scratched mirror above the sink. The face that looked back was leaner than the one in the SEAL team photo from 2002, harder in ways that had nothing to do with scars. The face of a man who'd survived by understanding that loyalty was a liability and honor was a story people told themselves to sleep at night. Holloway had believed in honor, had died believing it, hand frozen on a radio that would never reach help, trusting until the oxygen ran out that the Navy would come. McNeil washed his hands, dried them on brown paper towels, walked back to the Civic and continued south. Phoenix appeared as a smudge of light pollution against the darkening sky. He bypassed the city proper, staying on I-10 as it curved east toward Tucson. The border crossing at Nogales was another 90 minutes. He'd arrive after midnight, use the confusion of late-night truck traffic to slip through with forged commercial documents that identified him as a freight logistics coordinator for an agricultural export company that existed only on paper. The night settled in, stars emerging in the vast overhead dark. McNeil turned off the radio, preferred silence now, preferred the clean solitude of knowing exactly where he stood, alone, unencumbered, accountable to nothing but his own survival, the taillight housing cracked somewhere near Casa Grande. He didn't notice, didn't see the small spiderweb of broken red plastic that left the left rear signal dark. Didn't register the moment when a northbound Arizona Highway Patrol cruiser passed him going the opposite direction, and the trooper's eyes flicked automatically to the Civic's taillights, noted the malfunction, and made a U-turn at the next crossover. McNeil saw the light bar activate in his mirror at the same instant his phone buzzed with an alert he'd programmed. Warrant active. Federal channels. His hands stayed steady on the wheel. Pulse didn't spike. He'd planned for this contingency, too. He signaled, slowed, pulled onto the shoulder in a wash of red and blue strobe. Gravel crunched under the tires. The patrol car stopped 20 feet back, spotlight pinning the Civic in white glare. McNeil watched in the side mirror as the trooper ran the plate, watched him key his radio, watched him step out, tall, mid-30s, the careful movements of someone who'd seen deployment. The trooper approached driver's side, flashlight in left hand, right hand resting near his sidearm. McNeil had the window down, had the license ready, California issue, name David Brennan, address in San Luis Obispo. "Evening, sir. License and registration, please." McNeil handed them over. "Something wrong, officer?" "Left taillights out." The trooper examined the license, shone the flashlight briefly across McNeil's face, then into the vehicle's interior. "You know your light's broken?" "No, sir. Must have just happened." McNeil kept his voice neutral, polite but not obsequious, the performance of a civilian with nothing to hide. The trooper's nameplate read Castellano. He studied the license a moment longer, then straightened. "Wait here." McNeil waited. Watched Castellano return to the patrol car, watched him key information into the dashboard computer. The seconds stretched. 30, 45, 60. He could run. The Civic was faster than the Crown Victoria. But running meant helicopters, roadblocks, the certainty of capture. Better to maintain the fiction. The license was good. The registration was good. There was no reason for... Castellano's posture changed. Subtle, a fractional stiffening that McNeil recognized from 1,000 briefings, 1,000 missions, the body language of a man who'd just received information that changed the context of everything. The trooper stood, hand definitely on his weapon now, spoke into his shoulder mic. McNeil couldn't hear the words, but he understood the tone. Castellano approached again. This time he stayed back from the window, angled so he had a clear line of sight and draw. "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle. Slowly. Keep your hands where I can see them." "Officer, what's this about?" "Out of the vehicle. Now." McNeil complied, moved with the careful precision of a man who understood that compliance was tactical, stood on the shoulder with his hands raised, the desert wind cold against his face. Castellano ordered him to the ground. McNeil knelt, felt the trooper's knee in his back, the zip-tie restraints tight around his wrists, heard the radio chatter escalate, additional units responding, federal agents en route, instructions to hold position and secure the subject. Subject, not suspect. Subject. "What's your real name?" Castellano's voice was quiet, not angry, almost sad. McNeil said nothing. The license flagged a military alert, classified level. "You're McNeil, aren't you? The SEAL they're looking for." The stars overhead were very bright, the kind of clarity you only got in the desert, away from cities and their ambient glow. McNeil stared up at them and thought about the cave, about Holloway's final transmission that reached no one, about how far a man could run before the past caught him. "Yeah," he said finally. "I'm McNeil." Castellano radioed confirmation. In the distance, more sirens began their approach. The trooper stood over him, hand still on his weapon, and McNeil understood with perfect clarity that this was the end of forward motion, that all the preparation, all the contingencies, all the carefully constructed escapes led only here, a broken taillight on a desert highway, and a veteran cop who'd recognized something ineffable in the way a driver sat too straight when military protocol crackled over the radio. "I had him," Castellano said into his mic. "Subject secure and awaiting transport." McNeil closed his eyes, felt the asphalt's residual heat through his jacket, felt the wind and the weight of restraints and the absoluteness of capture. Somewhere in Virginia, Sarah Chen would receive notification, would close the file, would know that the last loose thread had been pulled tight. The sirens grew louder. McNeil opened his eyes and stared at the stars until the federal vehicles arrived and the desert filled with light. The March rain fell steadily over Arlington National Cemetery, turning the grass slick and the pathways into dark ribbons of asphalt that reflected the gray Virginia sky. Sarah Chen stood at attention beneath an umbrella held by a junior officer, watching 7 flag-draped caskets arranged in precise formation beneath the white canopy. Behind her, cameras from every major news network recorded what had become the most watched, military funeral in a generation. The first casket belonged to Lieutenant Commander Marcus Holloway. His daughters stood at the front, Marine Second Lieutenants Emma and Claire Holloway, their dress blues immaculate despite the weather. 26 years old now, the same age their father had been when he'd first held them. Their mother, Anya, stood between them, one hand on each daughter's shoulder. Her face was composed in a way that only came from 2 decades of practice. Chen watched as the honor guard lifted Holloway's casket, movements synchronized with military precision. She'd seen the autopsy photos, knew what 22 years in that cave had done to human remains. The families had been spared those details. What they received instead was the dignity of this moment, the ritual that transformed horror into honor. Pastor Elijah Patterson stood near the second casket. He was 86 now, bent with age but steady on his feet. His son Jerome's casket rested before him, finally home after being nothing but an absence for so long. The pastor's hands trembled slightly as he clutched his Bible, but his voice, when he spoke the opening prayer, carried the same resonant strength that had sustained his Detroit congregation through decades of sermons. "We commit these warriors to the ground," he said, "not in defeat, but in the certain knowledge that their courage was never broken, their honor was never stolen. They died protecting each other, and that is all that need be remembered." The rain intensified, drumming against the canopy like distant gunfire. Chen's eyes moved across the assembly. Meredith Hayes stood near David Reeves's casket, no longer his fiancée, but still carrying the engagement ring he'd given her 23 years ago. She'd remarried in 2019, finally allowing herself to move forward, but she'd come alone today. Some grief transcended current relationships. The families of the other 4 SEALs clustered around their own caskets, united in a brotherhood of loss that had defined their lives since October 2002. They'd formed their own support network over the years, meeting annually on the anniversary. Now they stood together in the rain, watching the ceremony that released them from the limbo of not knowing. The rifle salute cracked through the cemetery, 7 volleys that sent birds scattering from nearby trees. The honor guard moved with mechanical perfection, folding each flag into the precise triangle, presenting them to next of kin with words that had been spoken at countless funerals but had never felt more earned. On behalf of the President of the United States Navy, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved one's honorable and faithful service. Emma Halloway's jaw tightened as she accepted her father's flag. Claire stood rigid beside her, tears streaming down her face but her posture parade ground straight. They'd joined the Marines, because of the man in that casket, had made careers of the legacy he'd left them. Now they held the proof that he'd deserved every bit of faith they'd placed in his memory. Pastor Patterson held Jerome's flag against his chest, eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer. Chen had watched him testify at McNeil's court-martial, had seen him look directly at the defendant and speak words that stripped away any pretense of justification. "You took my son's life," he'd said, "but you couldn't take his honor. That was never yours to steal." The trial had lasted 3 weeks. The verdict took 40 minutes. Chen shifted her weight slightly, the classified file on McNeil's case still fresh in her mind, though she'd officially closed it 2 months ago. The evidence had been overwhelming, the confession recorded and transcribed. 8 counts of premeditated murder, conspiracy to commit espionage, fraud, obstruction of justice. The sentences ran consecutively, ensuring McNeil would die in prison even if he lived to be 100. But it was the family's victim impact statements that had defined the proceedings. Anya Halloway had spoken about raising her daughters alone, about the years of uncertainty that had been worse than grief. She'd described teaching them to remember a father they'd never known, to honor a man whose fate had been a mystery for longer than he'd been their husband. Meredith Hayes had read from the letters McNeil had sent her, the ones that had given her false hope, that had prolonged her suffering for his own manipulative purposes. Her voice had cracked only once, when she'd described finally accepting that David was gone, only to be torn open again by a stranger's cruel deception. The pastor had been the last to speak. He'd walked to the witness stand slowly, his age showing in each step, but when he'd turned to address the court, his voice had filled the room. "I am a man of God," he'd said. "I have preached forgiveness for 60 years, but I will not forgive this. Not for myself. Forgiveness is not mine to grant or withhold for crimes committed against my son. But I will bear witness to the truth. This man murdered 8 warriors who trusted him with their lives. He did it for money. He did it without mercy, and when he had the chance to save them, when they were dying in that cave, he walked away and let them suffocate in the dark." The silence that had followed had been absolute. Now, watching Jerome's casket being lowered into the ground, Chen wondered if the pastor had found peace in this moment, if any of them had. Closure wasn't the same as healing, and healing wasn't the same as forgetting. The ceremony concluded with taps, the mournful notes carrying across the cemetery and mingling with the rain. Chen had heard it countless times, but today it felt different. Final. These 7 men had been lost for 22 years, and now they were found. Not the way anyone had hoped, but found nonetheless. The families began to disperse slowly, some lingering at the grave sites, others seeking shelter from the rain. Chen made her way through the crowd, accepting quiet thanks from those who recognized her role in solving the case. She didn't feel like she deserved their gratitude. She'd just done her job. The credit belonged to a Somali fishing crew and a broken sonar system, and the simple fact that time eventually revealed all secrets. Emma Holloway intercepted her near the path. "Commander Chen." Chen had been promoted to commander 3 months ago, partly due to the McNeil case, partly due to 15 years of exemplary service. She still wasn't used to the rank. "Lieutenant," she said, offering her hand. Emma's grip was firm, her eyes direct. "I wanted to thank you for finding them, for bringing them home. I'm sorry it took so long. It wasn't your case until 2015. Emma glanced back at her father's grave, where Claire and Anya still stood. "We always knew he was dead. We just didn't know if he died honorably. Now we do." Chen nodded slowly. The video from the cave had shown men who'd fought to their last breath, who tried desperately to save each other even as they were dying. That knowledge had cost them everything, but it had also given them proof that the man they'd mourned had been worthy of their grief. "Your father was trying to transmit until the end," Chen said quietly. "His hand was on the radio when he died. He was trying to get help, trying to warn others." "The message in blood," Emma said. "Don't let them in. He thought they were under attack. The hallucinogen made them see threats that didn't exist. But even under the influence, even while dying, he was trying to protect his team." Emma's eyes glistened, but no tears fell. "That's who he was. That's who they all were." Chen watched the lieutenant walk back to join her family, shoulders squared despite the weight of the flag tucked under her arm. Some people carried grief like a burden. Others wore it like armor. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time Chen reached her car. She sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, not starting the engine, staring at the cemetery through the streaked windshield. Tomorrow, she'd return to her office at Naval Base Coronado. She'd begin training a new class of investigators, teaching them the techniques she'd use to unravel McNeil's deception. She'd share the lessons learned from the case. Trust the evidence, question the narrative, and understand that sometimes the most dangerous lies were the ones that sounded like truth. But today, she allowed herself to feel the weight of it. 7 men dead because one man had chosen money over honor. Families destroyed because one person had decided his future was worth more than their lives. The case file was closed. Justice had been served, but the cost of McNeil's betrayal would echo through generations. 1,700 miles west at the United States Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Travis McNeil sat on the edge of his bunk in a cell that measured 8 by 10 feet. The walls were concrete. The door was solid steel with a narrow observation slot. A small window near the ceiling let in filtered daylight but offered no view beyond a rectangle of gray sky. He'd been here for 93 days. He would be here for the rest of his life. The prison operated on a strict schedule. Meals came through the door slot. Showers were supervised and limited to 3 times per week. Exercise meant 1 hour in a small yard surrounded by concrete walls and razor wire. The rest of the time, 23 hours a day, he sat in this cell alone. They called it administrative segregation. It was supposed to be for his own protection. The prison population at Leavenworth included men who'd served in every branch of the military, men who'd lost friends to IEDs and ambushes, men who understood the brotherhood McNeil had betrayed. The warden had made it clear. General population would be a death sentence. So McNeil sat in isolation, staring at the single photograph taped to his wall. The date Bravo team photo from 2002. 8 men in tactical gear, arms crossed, arranged in 2 rows. He was in the back row, left side, smiling.